we went down a path which was not making it just a typical luxury resort, but trying to give it some character. Making something a little pretentious, but also in a way something that was very impressive for the other characters that go there.
Hi, and welcome back to StudioBinder Academy. I'm Brandon. Today we're speaking with production designer Roberto Bonelli, who's worked as an art director on projects like Apocalypto, Bardot, and Madame Web. He's also worked as a production designer on Hail Mary, Bandidos, and Blink Twice. Roberto, thanks so much for talking with me today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So first, we'd like to start with your background. What inspired you to be a filmmaker?
I think the first time I was really aware that there was such a thing as filmmakers and people who made these things, and there was this whole thing behind the scene, was a while after I saw Star Wars on VHS, which, as a kid, I loved. And then I saw a making of, but it was probably years later, maybe it was even to do with The Empire Strikes Back, that I started seeing that. I was just fascinated by it, by how they made it, how it felt like, because I was playing with, Star Wars items, and they had actually seemed like they were playing, There was this thing about creating worlds, which I also really liked from other sort of parts of playing, and it was very stimulating for me. I grew up in Denmark, and I played a lot with Lego as a kid, as a lot of Danes do. And I remember once, another kid saying, "Oh, you're really good at constructing these things," so. And I said, "Oh, well, maybe I am. I actually really enjoy it, And I think there was something about creating worlds for the characters which maybe interested me even more, So I played for a long time, even being a teenager, but it was not so much about the actual role playing. It was more about creating the worlds. So it did seem very, very far from Denmark, this whole, Hollywood thing and making feature films, also because the movies in Denmark did rarely have a lot of set design in them and production design. So I was also drawn to, as a young adolescent, to drawing in general, and into sort of pop cultures, like Andy Warhol, the way he overimposed, maybe you could say, but in a good way, as an artistical way. Graphic things like that interested me also. But then in high school, I found theater, and I was very, very into doing theater design. I, in a way, also really liked the limitation of the physical limitation of the space and the challenges you needed to create a different space in that. Like that kind of magic thing of you're somewhere, but now you're somewhere else, and this whole thing changes before your eyes. So that's where I kind of changed. I wanted to pursue that. I was still very fascinated by movies. And I think when I saw Blade Runner, then I was more mature in high school, was really fascinated about this thing because I've seen Star Wars, but that was on a planet. Now suddenly there was science fiction on Earth. And even though we were in the future, there was a very big presence of the past. And so that made me conscious of all the choices that have been made into getting this look, and I found that really interesting and sort of it inspired me also, even in theater work. But this whole thing about really thinking it through and opening up all of these different directions you could go into and sort of narrowing it down again. So I was always very much into film, but I think as a teenager, still in Denmark, it just seemed like it was so far away. So I just focused on theater. I tried to get into the Danish Theatre School because they have 2 spots for set designers a year. But it's kind of a world where you need to be a little more mature. I was only 18 when I applied. I did get to a second sort of interview, but it's a tough competition, and I think they're probably right in going with a little more mature people. It's something I've learned in this career is that it's very important to have experience as a production designer. And I think it's also very important to ready when you actually start studying. And I've also seen experience of many production designers who are actually self-taught production designer, but maybe they had some sort of other educations first. Some of them are architects, some of them are cabinet makers, some of them are graphic designers, and some. Well, I've even worked with a fantastic production designer, Oscar nominated, for Frida, whose previous education was to be a lawyer. So he was first a lawyer and then a self-made production designer, and it worked really well. It's Felipe Fernandez del Paso, which is actually the first production designer I worked for on a feature movie. So. So there are many ways of doing this, but I found out that I'm half Italian. So I found out I could also go to Italy and study. And in Italy, at the Academy of Fine Arts, they have a sort of different approach. They let you start young without knowing anything in a way. But then they will teach you a lot of basic stuff, which I think was good for me. It was a little hard. At that age, maybe history of art, like really classic history of art, going in, starting with the classic Greeks and getting into the Renaissance. It's sort of a heavy material for somebody who really wants to design theater sets, And there was a lot of moments where one think, what do I really need to know all of this for and all of that stuff? But now I know later that this was a great thing to have. Also, it also gives you discipline. And then we also, anyway, I got in there. I started in Palermo, and I started by studying, set design. But we had all of these complementary things, some of which we can choose, and some were already fixed in the studies, such as architecture. And in architecture, we started with very, very, very basic level of architecture, basically teaching us how to draw plans and structures and so on. But I had a great time in Italy, and I mean, the Academy of Fine Arts is a public school. They have them in all their major cities. I transferred to Florence, and there I started specializing in film and television. So basically, as I graduated, I sort of had a sort of technical schooling in drawing plans, in drawing sets, in drawing perspective drawings. And so I had a portfolio, and that's what I used to sort of get my first jobs. I also would like to mention that after 2 years, because it's a 4-year study, I did have moments of sort of doubting. I did go back to Denmark and considered studying something that was maybe more specific and practical, because we didn't get a lot of practical experience, particularly the first 2 years. So we didn't actually build any sets. We were just drawing them. We get to visit theaters, we get to go behind the stage, we get to go to the workshop, but we didn't do anything. But instead, I ended up working in a theater in Denmark, which was great. It was just great to get my hands on things and building things. I was lucky to be at a very small theater, but very hands-on with a lot of construction and a lot of miniatures, a lot of puppets. I also made some puppets in my period there. And it was just a great way of being allowed to do things. I think one of the things many people who come out with after their studies is how do they actually get to create stuff? How do they get their hands in the clay and molding things and getting stuff done, and they're after that being able to say, I have experience, because there's this thing coming out, I think particularly in Italy, because there's so many people coming out with that education, that it's hard to get your first job, which is also the reason why I opted to sort of go somewhere where maybe there was more chance of getting that first experience. And it so happened that I had transferred to Florence, and in Florence there's a lot more foreigners, there's both Americans, and I ended up knowing some Mexicans, and my girlfriend at the time was very interested in going to Mexico, and she basically set it up with one of her Mexican friends that as soon as I graduated, I should just come to Mexico and try and get a job on some of the many foreign productions that were being made in Mexico at the time. And it seemed a little crazy, but I just said, okay, well, let's go. It will be a great experience. And if not, then we'll go back to Italy, see what happens. But actually, I did get experience here early on. So I sort of had a first period here because I'm speaking to you from Mexico. I live here. I had, but it sort of was two periods. First of all, I came really, really young, and got this basic experience as a draftsman. I even drew storyboards. I worked as a scenic painter because one of the training periods I did have in Italy was I was at the Opera House in Verona, at the Arena of Verona, which is like the Colosseum but smaller, but they have a long opera season. I got a chance to work there for one season as a scenic painter, basically. Part of a huge team, which what makes these massive productions. But it was just a fascinating sort of thing to be in. And I used all of these mini experiences I've had once I got to Mexico to sort of get my first jobs. Also because I mainly did set design here. That's kind of where I got. It was also what interested me the most, but because I already had drawings, they were fictitious projects, but at least you could see that, the plans were right, That's kind of like today when I look at set designers, they're kind of the easiest one to hire because they will come out, they will have, these fictitious projects that they designed. It's much harder with set dressing because you really need to see something. They can't just send me some photos of some stuff they like, it's different. So I think in set design, there is that advantage for getting your first job. And I think in set dressing, it's more of, I think they start, at the bottom, basically helping out, slowly getting experience. But I did it that way. So I came in via set design, basically. It's a great passion. It's still a great passion for me. I love all the other, and I even done a movie myself as a set decorator. I love everything about it, but there's something about set design which I always hope the movies I work on have a certain degree of set design to do, because sometimes it's because of budget or for some reason or because it's all happening in the jungle and the desert. There's no set design, but I always feel very, very fond of that, and construction also. because that was sort of the next thing that I did. So once I did the sets, then I started following the sets a little bit, following up on the sets. Also with my experience as a scenic painter, I could also, follow the finishes through. And then once you're in charge of whole set from complete to beginning, then you're actually, in a way, an art director. But we didn't use that term at the end 90s. So it wasn't until I came back that became sort of like a thing, because at this point in Mexico, even the production designer was still called art directors. And then when they start having the art directors when the art directors became the production designers, they would usually only have one art director, and that would be a person who was basically like a supervising art director, being in charge of putting the whole crew together in the art department, making sure everybody was okay and running the whole thing, also financially. But I went back to Europe. We went back, and then I got some experience from otherwheres, and then I got the opportunity again to come back to Mexico in 2005. I did a movie here as a set designer, and there was a possibility of another movie, which then didn't happen. But then when it didn't happen, I just got so disappointed. I didn't really want to go back to Europe. By then, I was also, separated from my previous girlfriend. I was sort of totally free and unrooted. I had just been in China for 7 months. And I didn't feel like going back to Europe, It was also sort of kind of depressing times, even in the film industry, it goes ups and down. So I went back to Mexico. So I came back to Mexico to do that movie, and afterwards I just felt that there was so much more energy and I would almost say pride in the art process of making these sets or these things or the props or the furniture in particular. I was very fascinated about how much stuff you could actually make in Mexico with the relatively limited budgets, and how it was basically costing the same buying a designer sofa than actually having it made, So you could design your own designer sofa and have it made for the same price or less, as long as you had a little time, So basically that was how I got into it, and that was my sort of way into this whole industry.
Wow, that's such an incredible story. And for it all to start with Star Wars, I mean, I've done these interviews before, and so many filmmakers have said, Star Wars was their kind of entry point of like, wow, this is something I really want to do. And, for you with Legos and the concept of world building, starting from that early of an age and just kind of building from there, it's very truly inspiring.
I think many times when I hear my colleagues speak, a lot of them will say, well, I was doing other stuff, and then suddenly I came into this by chance or something. And a lot of people also found it late. And I understand that also, because you need to be mature as a production designer. So it's not a bad path. And I would just say that my path was maybe this whole thing of the more specific theater and also the specific training as a set designer, which is also a long sort of process. And then just, having also generally just life experience does make you a better production designer. And obviously being culture and going to exhibitions and, and seeing movies and theater, literature, all of this is sort of putting up this big sort of, sometimes we say luggage that you could sort of have with you with all this experience that you can then bring out when you need to, because that's sort of the foundation. apart from the technical stuff, which actually then you relearn again once you start doing it. Also because the way they construct sets is a little different in the different regions, and so you sort of need, and then the materials change and everything. Not all of them, but some change, and budgets influence, and so you always have to readapt. Whatever you learn, you have to relearn. In my experience.
Right. Yeah, that was actually going to be my question. It seems to be with production design, maybe more so than any other department in filmmaking, you have to have a lot of background. There's a lot of research. You have to know what this city looked like in this era to be able to recreate it. You have to know what the costumes look like, the vehicles, the architecture. So my question is, whenever you come into a project, what's your typical process in doing that type of research?
Well, the research and the way we do research depends a lot on the project. But in general, you would say there's always some obvious places to go for a certain part of it. Obviously, with the internet, it's easier to get the first sort of layer of stuff in. But then that's sort of just the surface. And then to get deeper, then you need sort of alternatives. Some of it can still be on the internet, but you just need to get off the sort of typical way of searching for things. Because you kind of need to get to the stuff that you don't know, like that you don't know. So I may say, okay, I'm well aware that I need to go and study this character or this person or this architect, this designer, or so on. But then you also need to find stuff, because there can be all this inspiration in this. I have rarely used people to help me with research. I know that on bigger production, it's very common, but also sometimes you need to do it because you don't know what you're looking for. In a way, it's hard to tell people, and can probably take longer time to tell people what they're looking for. What you're looking for, than to actually find it yourself. But it's a sort of a two-way process. Hopefully you have the time to do the obvious research first, digest it, kind of play ping pong with somebody, either a director or either your crew, your decorator, your art director, or so on, which also have inputs. And then I find that many times, for instance, let's say it's a historical movie, that there might be some really good references, not from that place and not from that period, that can still be good references. Like you could maybe find a market in Thailand and say, so I really like this vibe, but obviously this needs to be Mexico, and maybe the photo is from the 70s, but we need to be today or in the 90s or whatever. So let's bring it to that date, and let's bring it to this territory, but let's have that atmosphere. That can also be a research. And then there are also occasionally when you're in something that happened hundreds of years ago, then there are also blanks. There are areas where there are no research. You do all the research and you find out that there are conflicting stories about how this actually was in history. And then there's also, archaeologists who are not quite agreeing. And then it's kind of up to you to say, well, what do you think? And sometimes you're also saying, okay, but if it's conflicting, then maybe there's freedom here to decide what we think works better for the movie, So there's also, let's call it selective research. You kind of select the things that you think will tell this story the best way, because sometimes you need to take all the research, you need to know it, and then you have to say, well, I'm going to have to put in a little bit of freedom here in order to. I mean, it happens more in the script actually than I think in the production design, but sometimes that's necessary. I think in terms of production design and research, what happens is it's more like that people would not accept the reality. It looks wrong. And then you have to alter it a little bit. Like certain things with just such bright colors or so pristine that it looks fake. And so sometimes you feel you need to put like a layer of aging on top of it or so on, like tone it down a little bit or control certain things, because else it just seems fake, so then that's a thing. I think my biggest challenge with research was doing a very famous Mexican historical character from the independence from Spain called Morelos. And in this case here, there's a famous painting of him, but that painting was painted, 100 years after he was dead, and that's not what he looked like, and that's not what he was wearing, and whatever's in the background is just what this painter had in his mind, 100 years later. But it's still then very hard to convince the audience what the reality is. So sometimes you have to take a little bit of this pseudo-realism that somebody created 100 years later in order for it to be sort of edible for the audience. It's a little odd, but I think slowly you find that balance, and when you do a historical project, you're always going to get some kind of criticism. I think it's very hard to avoid it, but it's a big challenge always, and it's a great pleasure doing historical things. You just have a lot of time. So.
Right. So moving on, every project always has its unique challenges. What would you say were the challenges on Blink Twice?
I think in Blink Twice, it was telling a lot about the characters, and particularly our main character, which is this billionaire. In our story, he's called Slater King, but he's played by Channing Tatum. Because he's kind of trying to pretend to being one thing while still being something else. And we're not in his home ever, we're at his residence, So usually, when we do production design, and particularly in the set dressing, you will have all of these items that will tell all these backstories about the characters. That is, their home, their kitchen, their living room, their drawer. In this case, we had a drawer open and there's just one thing in there. It's totally empty. So that is a challenge, because you're taking away, the typical things that we use, the typical tools we use to tell background stories. And so we have very little background stories on these characters. It's more about who they pretend to be, and it's not that they're con artists. It's just we all sometimes pretend to be something else. But I had a good experience before then. I made a coming of age movie with some young kids. And there also, it was not a big movie, but it was more like a microcosm, because one of the main places was the bedroom of one of these kids. And he was very much trying to be a very cool kid. But this was, which he was, but he was just a very different kid, but he was very much trying to be older, cooler, harder, all of those things. So there had to be little hints of somebody pretending to be something and then actually something else. I think with in this case here, it was making something a little pretentious, but also in a way something that was very impressive for the other characters that go there, and then early on with Zoe, the director, we went down a path which was not making it just a typical luxury resort, but trying to give it some character. And this was because also with the scouting presented the options of old haciendas that had been remodeled and had sort of some of the old culture. It just gave some more depth to the character. So basically, I think that there was a big challenge in trying to find that fine line of where to go with this.
I also wanted to ask you about an interview that I had read that you've done about your process with Blink Twice. You described it as you had to put yourself in the shoes of the billionaire's designer who kind of presented this place, who he hired to design that place. I thought that was very interesting. It's almost as if you're acting, you know, you're playing another role in your job to design this place. So what was that process like of, designing a space in someone else's shoes?
Well, I think this idea came because I've had it before with a science fiction project that I worked on for a long time, which had a lot of architecture in it. And then it was kind of like, well, how do you go about this? Where do you find your research? And you go usually back to the old schools and the special periods of something which was very modern at the time, and then classic things and so on. But then I kept thinking of this. I actually can't remember his name, but basically one of the main architects for Adolf Hitler, who suddenly was just given this task of just building a new empire with a totally new style, and obviously very classic inspired, but something else. And they had to have a very strong identity because, they were going to take over the world. And I just thought, there would be a little bit of that character, but then also mix with Frank Lloyd Wright, and then mix with some of the more, maybe not interesting, that was the wrong word, but more bombastic designers, even furniture designers. And then you mix it all up and this, but then rather than taking from them all and putting it in a blender, it becomes a weird thing. It was almost like creating a character that had a little bit of all these things, In that case, it was certainly somebody who was being seduced by a dictator, and then just giving free hands, And so in this case here, I felt maybe you should apply some of that to it. Also because some of the pieces are not necessarily, good taste. We wanted to have a lot of good taste in that place to sort of, and it's so subjective, good taste. But something that you can say, okay, they're gonna think this is really cool when they appear there, for the first time, and not pretentious, but in a way it is actually really pretentious. And then just this obsession with designer furniture and sort of very bold pieces. And then when we got to the chair design, it was very hard for me to actually do something that I liked. We had to stay well away from existing designs, particularly in the chair, because the chair also in the end, in one cut, gets set on fire. There's all of these, I hope I'm not spoiling anything for anyone, but there's all of these things. It's connected with bad things, the chair. And also, it was sort of complex. So it had to not look like anything, and then it need to be very, very noticeable. It was actually having a more important role in previous scripts where we sort of carried around. It was at one point it was on the plane with them, and there was all these things about this designer chair. And so particularly there, I felt like, well, why would he have this chair and all of these things? And so I felt like almost taking up this alter ego as the designer of the main character. That's where I sort of got a little bit into character, and it was easier for me in a way to say, oh yeah, this should be this and this should be that, and we should be really bold here and so on, because it wasn't really in my nature, not how I would make my house, but it needed to sort of be the right character for that place. So that's why it was a little bit, like you said, like putting on a character and designing with all of that in mind. Also in terms of this whole selling process, of how you sell an interior design that is so minimalistic. Because maybe if it had a lot more stuff, it wouldn't have been so pretentious. Sometimes it's a little hard to sell luxury with very few elements, But that's why it ended up being like that. And it was a sort of a little process before we got to it, and then suddenly, we were all on the same page. It's also about communication, really to understand, to being able to explain, why somebody has to have a look like that. There's a lot of practical stuff for the film also that needs to work. So it's a lot of conversation, not only with the director, also with the DP, because a lot of it is about atmospheres. So getting those atmospheres is also very much a collaboration with the director of photography, in this case, Adam Newport-Bear.
Right. You have to decide what that atmosphere is going to be, how you're going to create it, and then how they're going to capture it. And if you're not on the same page, I'm sure that could go in any number of ways. Now, I'm sure one discussion that you may have had with the DP was the use of color. There's a lot of use of primary colors, yellows, reds, and blues, big, very bold choices. Could you talk to the goal behind the use of those colors and how they became such a big part of the aesthetic?
Yes, and there's also a lot of green. I mean, there was green naturally in the location, but we also brought it in to other areas. I mean, we brought it in. Jess's bedroom or bungalow is green. They're also green in other areas. But yes, I would say they are kind of primary color, but they're not the clean primary color. They're all tweaked and toned into a certain directions. They're probably more close to sort of antique primary colors. The red is kind of, blood red. The yellow is a bit more towards mustard. The blue is there's a bit more variation in the blues, and there's all the tones of greens also. In the blues, we have some really strong blues, which was meant to also be saying something's off here, something's weird. Like when she has the realization that the other girls don't know who Jess is, then it's she's wearing this blue mask, and it's almost like a strange theatrical thing, It's looking really weird on frame. And the same thing, her bungalow is also blue, which looks very elegant in the beginning, but then suddenly when everything is weird, it's a great color to have her in. This is Frida I'm talking about. And the blue came up early. I think there was more Zoe that wanted to have that off color. And then we were just balancing the other colors with the nature, our location. Our location was actually red when we started. So we took that, we turned it into maybe that's the Slater King color. We did consider painting the location. I have a lot of renders where it's pink and black. Just because we were trying out this thing, well, if he's so He wants to be bold. He wants to be over the top. He wants to be, noticeable of somebody who is daring, let's say culturally, who is a philanthropist, who's out there, who's reformed from just being, the stereotype billionaire, and now he's into all of this. That was the thing behind the boldness of all of this. That is in a way daring. And then there was also something about balancing all our characters in there. We have basically all the skin colors of United Colors of Benetton in there. We have all of them. So we need to also create a balance where everybody looks good in this in the beginning, and then. Because it's all about that. The movie's also about it needs to everything just looks so good in the beginning, and then suddenly it just gets weirder and weirder and darker and darker. But the part of what we were supposed to achieve in the art department with everything was to create this illusion that is everything is perfect. It is all you ever dreamed about. Everybody looks beautiful the whole time. Everything is, and it's not pretentious. I mean, I'm saying it is, but it is underneath, But at the first thing you think, oh, this is so cool, and like, oh, this is homegrown, and this has history, and all of this. So that was the idea behind that, and we also wanted to create the art sort of tableau where you could have this big composition, because there's also this play sometimes them playing very very posh characters, and so it was nice to have some sort of big walls to do these theatrical things with. But we painted all of the interiors at the location, and then we also needed to build all the big interiors on stage in Mexico City, because we shot in Yucatan at a real hacienda, but it couldn't accommodate the big space where some very important scenes happened. So we built those in Mexico City. Mm-hmm. And then there was another interesting setup, which was the dinner scenes. There are 3 dinner scenes there, and there's a lot of stuff going on, and there's a lot of characters, and it also needs to be sort of interesting, and it needs to change and getting into freaky. So there we opted to use one of the industrial areas of the hacienda, which still had rough walls. We didn't do them up, but it only had 3 walls and a roof. It was totally open to the jungle on the last sides. And they had machinery there originally, and there was just some bits left of that machinery. So we used that for our big dining setup in order to get that special atmosphere there, which was also in some occasion just lit up by candle lights. So it also needed to work for that.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Speaking of the dinner scenes, the food, or at least the look of the food, it seemed to be a big part of it. Now, does the design of the food kind of fall under your purview, or whose job is it to design how the food actually looks?
Well, the production designer is in charge of how the food looks, so that would be me. But obviously, just like I had a wonderful decorator, great prop master, and wonderful art director to help me with all the stuff we constructed. Then I also had people help me with the food. So in this case, I wanted to look at all the food that was out there, and we actually went and ate at a lot of restaurants and spoke to a lot of chefs. So that was a nice part of the research. Getting back to that, and we ended up doing a collaboration with a local restaurant in Mérida where we were staying in Yucatan, called Nectar. And then we also had a film food stylist to be involved, because we need to run this show and be in charge of it. But we certainly had a good collaboration also with Nectar to make the food happen. And it was difficult because it's hard to... food's a little different on camera, particularly because two of the scenes were only lit by candlelight. So we needed to have stronger colors. And again, also this whole thing of being over the top was also a thing for the food. And again, also there was the occasional thing about what if they just had something really normal, but done up as a really extravagant dish. That's particularly in the desserts. And all of this is invented in the story by a very pretentious friend of our main character. So again, it's getting in with the characters and not just making what you would like to have yourself, but what is right for the movie. That goes for everything we design, I think.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I think this is a good lesson for our viewers to learn is that, you start conceptually about what this movie is about, what are the themes, what these characters or who they are. These are more abstract things that are getting told or communicated subtly, with the design of the place, the look of the furniture, the look of the food, all of these things are tying back into some of these bigger ideas. And so I think this is a pretty good lesson for people to learn, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and I think in this case here, it was very much about managing emotions. Just like the music, the score is playing with the emotions of the audience. I think also the colors did. They were part of also subconsciously bringing them into doubts or having them on a happy high and then into the sort of, no, don't do that, those kind of emotions. And I think this is all being orchestrated. So that also means that it's not just about choosing your favorite colors. It's about, again, collaborating and making sure all of these things sort of come together.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I love the idea of, like you said, guiding emotions, the tone, the storytelling, just as much as anything else. And all of these things are just kind of working in concert. Now, I do want to go back a little bit to the design of the furniture. You were saying the design of the chair you couldn't use in any existing designs. And I would assume that's for legal reasons. And if that is the case, was it a budget issue or was it the designer not agreeing to the use of their design, or what was behind that decision?
In the case of the chair, it was definitely a legal issue, which is fine. It's a good challenge. In other cases, there are certain cases where it's simply cheaper to just make your own furniture, depending also on what it is. But it's also just great to have the freedom to be able to do so. Obviously, it's not easy because designing a chair, a table, deck chairs, it's an art form and people study that for years. There will always be some kind of synthesis of different things. Nowadays, it seems like everything has been designed already. But I think what is the job of the production designer is setting this mood. So certain things can be bought, but then there's just sometimes where you just can't find a thing on the market that you need. Particularly that was the case with the deck chair, because those ones we could certainly buy, and they probably ended up being more expensive. But we also wanted to work with sort of local materials and have that feeling of the Caribbean. So in the end, we ended up using a local tree sort from Yucatan, and basically got some inspiration from a cabinet for the legs, and just made some very simple frames and some very simple sort of what do you call them, mattresses or pillows to go on it. Again, it was more about the vibe, the tone, the color. Nobody was really gonna analyze too much what these textures were. At some point, we had a bit more of a statement around the pool, but the statement ended up being, the big marble slabs. Because we changed that. We changed that from the original pool area was different. And they are going back to the challenges. The challenge there was that we had little time to prep because it was a very expensive location. So we had little time on the location. And then we also had to get everything back to normal again very fast afterwards. So none of the stuff we did stayed there. So our location is actually a functioning hotel, but we changed it totally. So it's still a very cool place to visit, but it's not at all like in the movie. So we put down this. First of all, we put a plastic on top of the existing stone. Then we put a very thin layer of sand, and then we lay very large marble slabs on top of it, so that they would stay there and not move for about 3 weeks when we shoot in there, and then we could take them off quickly. Again, also local marble from Yucatan that we would just put up there temporarily. That became more of the look. Oh, and the other thing we also ended up doing was the umbrellas. We also went a little back and forth. And then we ended up making an umbrella, which was, the large pool-size umbrella, but inspired in the small Japanese, personal umbrellas. Again, same wood, and we also used a lot of natural colors, natural linen, a lot. So that was, so I would say we had wood, we had natural colors, white, cream, beige, and then we have sort of the, let's call them the dirty primary colors also that could make these sort of bold tableaus. Another reason for having those colors is also once we got to the studios, we also wanted to repeat certain colors, so you kind of felt connected. So you kind of felt you're in this very unique space here. So that was certainly not because of either budget or license. I did consider particularly some armchairs for some of the other areas by some very famous designers. I thought it would be good to have known designers in the movie. It would give it a certain credibility, and you can get some licenses. It takes a while, but it's not impossible to get a license to use some very high-end furniture design. It is also very expensive. I think in the end, we just felt we didn't need it. The style also changed a little bit into becoming more of the designing trend of where you find old furniture and you restore it, and the authenticity mixed with pieces of furniture that looks like sort of art pieces, even though they're extremely comfortable. They look cool. We had some of those also. So we ended up doing that in the end. Also because we needed maybe to spend a little more on the budget on creating the construction in Mexico City, which became a little more complicated because there was a lot of going in and out of those rooms. So you had more of a connection to the outside. It seems very simple in the beginning to say, okay, we need to construct a little bit on stage also because, we have a fire. But then once you chose your location, after this whole thing has been budgeted, and you realize, we have a lot of coming in and coming out. So we need some of the exterior also. So we built the terrace, and we built up to the first handrails, and then there's some steps going down. So we didn't build any of the lawn, obviously, but then we had a giant photo of the location behind that. Lots of greens to sort of break it up. And that worked really well. But that ended up costing more. And then we were also looking into shooting in a private jet. That didn't seem like a good plan for the shots that they wanted. So in the end, we also built that. So that obviously once you're all locked on budget, you have to slim down somewhere else. And at that point, we were sort of just jamming with a look of our designer furniture style that we just said, let's just go with that. It seems right. So we just did more and more. And once you've got a workshop up and running, then it just seems easier. We also got a lot of local stuff. The location actually put us in contact with a foundation called Taller Maya, which basically just means Mayan workshop. And they do a lot of stuff sort of manually, both sculptural stuff in the same stone, the Mayan marble, which is just called Mayan cream, the stone. So we had there was a lot of little ramekins, all the little stuff in the bathroom is from them. They also do a lot of knitted stuff. They do a lot of stuff. The hacienda originally made fibers out of the cactuses, and that could make ropes, or that can make other stuff to make hammocks, baskets. So all of those were from this local company. And then we also we did buy chairs, and we did buy sofas, and a lot of practical lamps, obviously. We made the 3 giant lamps over the dining table. That's just fiberglass. It's supposed to look like some metal, brass or copper or something. We built the dining table, and then we did a lot of fabric things, a lot of natural linen. All the chairs were just covered with red natural linen, and it's the same chairs playing at breakfast, but there they have white natural linen on top of them. So there were ways of getting, all of those things done. And then also, once we were in Mexico City, the film opens with this and ends with a big gala event, a charity event. And for that, we looked at a lot of places, and there was just one place where we thought, if it could be here, it would really give us something special. And the thing was, it was a very, very limited location. But in the end, our very heroic location department really put in hard work. They got us the location, and they even got us some permissions to actually build in there. Because of the limitations, we had very little time in there. But we worked on 2 places. We worked at the bottom floor, where they sort of set out like tables and canopies and drinks and speeches. And then there's another area where there's supposed to be an auction, and it's just set up amongst a ton of sculptures. All of these sculptures are real sculptures in the museum, and they're all hundreds of years old. They're totally unreplaceable. But the light in there didn't work to get the scene, the natural light, and we were not allowed to change the lighting there. And the only option we had was to actually build a truss structure to make a big soft light over a certain area. And we got permission to do that. It was very nerve-wracking. We then didn't want it to look at the truss legs. So then they were all cladded in and MDF that was then painted all pristine. Well, actually, it was all pre-painted, and it just went sampled on top of it. So that was a hard montage because, you know, I don't know what we would have done it with if we had, you know, ruined anything, you know. And also then there was the time issue, doing the whole thing with this time limit. That was a little edgy to be there. But seeing the movie, I really think it's worth it. I think it gives it this, also the authenticity and the being amongst all of these sculptures. I think it also sort of, it's a very different vibe from the rest. The red color sort of goes through it. That's kind of Slater King's logo color. But it's supposed to be a totally different look, like they're in a different world there, you know? And then in that place, we also did this sort of upstairs, downstairs, this kind of the backstage area to this event, which was also interesting to do, you know, just to have the different social areas. So they start in the downstairs area, in the backstage, in the locker room, to this massive, elegant event that's so pristine and stylish. And then, you know, they end up, you know, going with these guys. This is kind of sort of setting up the whole thing, why they would accept such a thing. There was also a discussion, you know, that we had, you know, it had to be, you had to be able to understand these characters, because we didn't want the audience just to say, well, they were really dumb in the first place, you know, why would they jump on a plane with these dudes, you know?
Yeah, it's building some credibility there. Well, Roberto, we have one more question for you.
Yeah.
If you could go back to the beginning of your career, what advice would you give yourself?
I think it's very important to know that, you know, it's sort of a team discipline doing movies, you know, and also within the art department. I think it's important to learn skills, to learn them, just so that you have the capability of learning skills, but that you're also open to renewing. And then I also think that it's important to have a certain patience. You know, in the beginning, it's very hard to get a chance. And I think also, in a way, you have to find out also a way of, before you get your first job, you have to find a way of showing your capability. And that's where skills sort of comes into it a little bit. You know, nowadays, it will probably be somebody will learn some 3D programs, and then you can, you know, do your own sets, and you can put texture on them. You can even decorate them. And then people can sort of judge a little bit from that. It's very time consuming, but I think it's worth it. That could be one thing. And then also, I think you have to have a certain, going back to the patience, once you do have a job, you have to have a patience of being able to fit into the team, you know, like give it some time. I think many times in art departments, if you can really get along with the people and withstand the stress situations, there will be a big reward for that later on. You know, just by not quitting, you might have earned your next job. But I also understand it's hard because there will always be, you know, moments where maybe you're totally entitled to should have quit, you know, because it's a hard industry. But and I'm certainly not saying that it's an industry where you should accept any abuse at all. On the contrary, and I think it's getting a lot better. But it's just very intense, you know, and I think it's very important that one makes a huge effort of getting along with the fellow team members, and if one can learn to be a team player, then I think there's a future there, at least within the art department, you know. I also think production designer needs to be team players. I think it's very important that they can be a team with not only the director, also with the director of photography, wardrobe stylist, producers, location managers. We had a lot of collaboration also with stunts. We had some visual effects, on other occasions. I think it's a bigger collaboration. And then you also need to be able to express everything to your team. So you also have to be more of a team manager. For that, you need to be able to set up a good team, a team that you can, be a long time in intense situations with, because that's what it's like. It's certain movies are more like being a traveling circus, especially if you're not at home, but out in the jungles somewhere.
Right. Well, Roberto, thank you so much for your time. It's been such an incredible time speaking with you. And I really enjoyed Blink Twice and can't wait to see what you do next.
Thank you very much.
For more filmmaker interviews or deep dives into the StudioBinder software, like and subscribe to be notified when new videos are added. I'm Brandon with StudioBinder Academy. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.